Did you know that during the deadliest conflict in human history, more Americans went to the movies each week than went to church? Or that the biggest hit song of the era was about a love affair that had to wait until the lights went on again all over the world? It seems strange. When the world is falling apart, when cities are dark and futures are uncertain, what do people do? They seek a sliver of light, they fight for a moment of normalcy. They wage a global war for a smile. This wasn't just about frivolous escape. It was about survival. It was about remembering what it felt like to be human. How did they do it? How did millions of people, from soldiers in foxholes to families in blacked out cities, find ways to entertain themselves, to connect, to feel something other than fear? What can their search for joy in the darkest of times teach us about ourselves? Number 21. Did a garden save more than just a stomach? It started with a simple idea. Food was a weapon. The ships that once brought bananas and sugar were now carrying tanks and troops. The farms that grew wheat were short on hands, so governments on both sides of the Atlantic asked their citizens to fight back with soil and seeds. They called them victory gardens in the United States and Canada, and dig for victory gardens in Britain. The campaign was everywhere. Posters showed families in neat rows, harvesting giant, perfect vegetables. It looked like a cheerful weekend hobby. It was much more than that. By 1943, an estimated 20 million victory gardens were growing in the United States alone. They produced around 9 to 10 million tons of fruit and vegetables. That was about 40% of all the fresh produce consumed in the country. Think about that. Nearly half the vegetables on American plates came from backyards, apartment rooftops, and converted flower beds. In Britain, the numbers were just as stark. The Royal Horticultural Society published pamphlets on everything from composting to pest control. Even the moat at the Tower of London was drained and filled with cabbages. But this wasn't just about food security. It was a profound form of entertainment. It was a project. It gave people a sense of control when everything else was chaos. You couldn't stop the bombers, but you could fight the slugs attacking your lettuce. You couldn't speed up the end of the war, but you could watch a tomato ripen on the vine. It was a tangible, hopeful process. The work was physical, a release for the anxiety that hummed in the background of daily life. It was a family activity, a way for parents and children to work together, to get their hands dirty, to create something. Gardening also became a social event. Neighbors who barely knew each other were suddenly swapping seeds and complaining about aphids. Odd communities organized competitions for the biggest, pumpkin or the longest runner bean. It was a source of pride. A well-kept garden was a patriotic statement. It showed you were doing your part. Eleanor Roosevelt even planted a victory garden on the White House lawn in 1943, a powerful symbol that everyone was in this together. This was a war fought not just on distant battlefields, but in every patch of available dirt. It was a quiet, green rebellion against scarcity and fear. We know how many tons of carrots were produced, and how many pamphlets were printed, but how many family arguments were settled while weeding a row of potatoes. How many children first learned about life and death by watching a plant wither, or a seed sprout? And in the silent moments of tending to the earth, how many people found a peace they couldn't find anywhere else? A piece that was just as vital as any ration coupon. Number 20. Could you hold the world in your hands? Long before the internet, there was another way to shrink the globe. It was called stamp collecting. And during the war, this quiet, meticulous hobby took on a new and urgent meaning. For many, it was a window to a world that was suddenly inaccessible. A world without borders, checkpoints, or enemy lines. A world you could organize in a neat little album. Philately, the formal name for stamp collecting, was a popular pastime before the war, but the conflict supercharged it. Suddenly, stamps weren't just pretty squares of paper. They were artifacts. A letter arriving from a soldier overseas carried a postmark that told a story of its journey. A stamp from an occupied country was a tiny symbol of a nation that still existed, even if its government was in exile. Collectors hunted for these pieces of history with a passion. The hobby was a perfect antidote to the anxieties of the era. It required focus and patience. Organizing stamps by country, by year, by color, it was a calming, methodical task. It imposed order on a world that had none. It was also an educational escape. A child in Ohio could look at a stamp from India or Australia and dream of faraway places. They could learn about geography, culture, and history through these miniature engravings. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was perhaps the most famous collector of his time. He often spent his evenings with his stamp albums, finding it a way to relax and detach from the immense pressures of his job. He once said, "I owe my life to my hobbies, especially stamp collecting." Stamps also became tools of propaganda and resistance. The Allied powers issued stamps celebrating their shared values and military victories. The German regime printed stamps with its own stark and imposing symbols. In occupied territories, underground movements sometimes printed and circulated their own Cinderella stamps, unofficial labels that carried messages of defiance. These were dangerous items to own. Finding one and hiding it in your album was a small, personal act of rebellion. The hobby wasn't just about looking at the past, it was about participating in a small way in the present conflict. It was a quiet, intellectual front line. We know which stamps are the rarest and how much they are worth. We have catalogs detailing every perforation and watermark. But how many secret messages were passed using the placement of a stamp on an envelope, a code that has been lost to time? How many people maintain their sanity by escaping into the miniature, orderly world of their stamp albums while bombs fell outside? And what did it feel like for a collector to hold a stamp from a country that, for a time, had been wiped off the map entirely? Number 19 was laughter a secret weapon. There's a type of humor that only flourishes in the dark. It's called gallows humor. And during the war, it was a vital part of the psychological arsenal for soldiers and civilians alike. Jokes became a way to cope with the absurd, to humanize the inhuman, and to poke a finger in the eye of an enemy that demanded to be taken seriously. On the home front, humor was a shield against the daily grind of rationing, blackouts, and bad news. The cartoons in newspapers and magazines were incredibly popular. In Britain, the cartoonist David Lowe became a national hero for his sharp, satirical drawings of the German leader and his allies. He depicted them not as terrifying supermen, but as blustering, ridiculous figures. This was a powerful act. It reduced the enemy from a monstrous threat to a laughable buffoon. In the United States, Bill Malden's Willie and Joe cartoons in the Stars and Stripes newspaper gave a voice to the common soldier. His characters were cynical, mud-covered, and utterly exhausted, but they faced the horrors of combat with a dry, sarcastic wit that resonated deeply with the troops. They weren't heroes, they were survivors. Jokes spread like wildfire. They were told in pubs, in air raid shelters, and on factory floors. Many of them were about the scarcity of food. Have you heard the one about the new government sausage? It's 10% pork, 10% breadcrumbs, and 80% suspense. These jokes didn't magically produce more food, but they created a shared experience of hardship. Laughing at the problem made it, for a moment, a little smaller. It was a way of saying, yes, this is awful, but we're all in it together and we haven't been broken. For soldiers, humor was even more critical. It was a defense mechanism against trauma. In his book Wartime, literature professor Paul Fussell explains how soldiers use ironic and dark humor to create a sense of detachment from the constant presence of death. They gave grim nicknames to deadly weapons. They told jokes in the trenches that would seem shocking to outsiders. This wasn't because they were callous, it was because it was the only way to stay sane. Laughter was a brief, convulsive release of tension. It was a reminder that even in a landscape of destruction, the human spirit could find a reason to make a noise other than a scream. It was a small, loud act of defiance. We have collected the cartoons and written down some of the jokes, but humor is fleeting. How many whispered jokes in a darkened barracks gave a group of soldiers the strength to face the next day? What was the funniest thing ever said in an air raid shelter that stopped a child from crying? And how many times did a shared bitter laugh between two people forge a bond stronger than any military training could provide? Number 18, could a voice in a box win a war? Imagine a world without screens. No phones, no TVs, no internet, just a wooden box in the living room. That box was the center of the universe for millions during the war. It was the radio, and it was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a lifeline. In an era of rumor and propaganda, the radio offered a voice of authority. In Britain, the BBC became the sound of the nation. The calm, measured tones of its newsreaders delivering reports from the front lines were a source of stability. And then there was the voice of the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. His speeches, broadcast to the world, were masterful pieces of theater. They were entertainment as morale. People would gather around the radio, hanging on every word. His defiance became their defiance. In America, Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats did something similar. He spoke to the nation as if he were a guest in their living rooms. He explained complex military and political situations in simple, direct language. The radio created a sense of intimacy and national unity that had never been possible before. But it wasn't all news and speeches. The radio was the primary source of entertainment. Comedy shows were massive. In Britain, It's That Man Again Itma, a madcap sketch show, was so popular that its catchphrases entered the national vocabulary. In the US, shows like Fibber McGee and Molly and the Jack Benny program gave families a reason to laugh together. For 30 minutes, they could forget the war and get lost in a world of silly jokes and sound effects. Music, of course, was king. The big bands ruled the airwaves. Glenn Miller, the Andrews Sisters, Tommy Dorsey, their music was the soundtrack of the era. The Armed Forces Radio Service AFARS, launched in 1942, became a global broadcaster, bringing American music and entertainment to troops stationed all over the world. Shows like Command Performance featured the biggest stars of the day, Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, Judy Garland, performing for a military audience. These broadcasts were a powerful reminder of home. They were a link to the world they were fighting for. The radio could, in an instant, transport a soldier from a muddy foxhole in the Pacific to a dance hall in New York. The enemy understood the power of the radio too. Propaganda broadcasters like Lord Haw-Haw, William Joyce in Germany, and Tokyo Rose in Japan directed their broadcasts at Allied troops, trying to sow doubt and homesickness. The fact that both sides invested so heavily in broadcasting shows just how important this war of the airwaves was. The radio wasn't just background noise. It was a battleground for the hearts and minds of millions. We know the broadcast schedules and the ratings for popular shows. We have recordings of the famous speeches, but how many soldiers in remote outposts survived purely on the hope delivered through a crackling radio signal? We know about the famous propaganda broadcasts, but what about the subtle ones? Were coded messages hidden in weather reports or music shows, messages we still haven't deciphered? And could a modern society saturated with media ever again find a single voice as unifying as the ones that came from those simple wooden boxes? Number 17 was a comic book, a training manual. In June 1938, a new superhero appeared. He wore a blue suit, a red cape, and could leap tall buildings in a single bound. 2 years later, he was punching the leader of the German regime on the cover of a comic book. A few months after that, another new hero, clad in red, white, and blue, was doing the same. Superman and Captain America had gone to war, and they took millions of children with them. Comic books were cheap, colorful, and easy to get. They were the perfect wartime entertainment for young people, and they didn't shy away from the conflict. In fact, they dove in head first. The storylines were simple and direct. The heroes were good. The enemy was evil. There was no moral ambiguity. Captain America, whose first issue appeared in March 1941, 9 months before the U.S. officially entered the war, was literally created to be a patriotic super soldier. His alter ego was a frail young man named Steve Rogers, who was deemed unfit for military service, but desperately wanted to help his country. This was a powerful fantasy for kids who felt helpless in the face of global events. These comics did more than just entertain. They were a form of soft propaganda. They taught children who to root for and who to hate. They encouraged them to participate in the war effort. Covers and inside pages were filled with ads, urging kids to buy war bonds and stamps. Characters like Superman and Batman would foil spy rings, sink enemy submarines, and sell war bonds themselves. They made patriotism seem exciting and heroic. The comics also provided a sense of power to the powerless. A child reading these stories could imagine being strong enough to defeat any bully, fast enough to stop any bomb. In a world of frightening newsreels and serious adult conversations, comics offered a universe where good always triumphed, where a single righteous individual could make a difference. The readership was huge. Historian Gerard Jones notes that by the mid-1940s, comic books were selling close to 25 million copies a month, and that didn't account for the swapping and sharing that went on between friends. This wasn't just an American phenomenon. In Britain, comics like the Beano and the Dandy featured characters who also did their part, outwitting bumbling enemy spies and getting into scrapes related to rationing and air raids. The stories were less about superheroes and more about the mischievous resilience of ordinary kids. The message was the same: even children could be brave and clever in the face of adversity. For millions of kids, the war wasn't just something they heard about on the radio. It was a four-color adventure they could hold in their hands for a dime. We know the sales figures and we can analyze the patriotic content on the pages, but how many children were inspired to collect scrap metal for the war effort because they saw Captain America do it? Did the simple morality of these stories a good versus absolute evil shape the worldview of a generation in ways we still don't fully understand? And how many soldiers carried a folded up comic book in their pack, a fragile, colorful reminder of the childhood they had left behind? Number 16, did a dance craze defy gravity and despair? The music started with a driving, syncopated rhythm. The horns blared, the beat was infectious, and then the dancers would explode. It was called the jitterbug or the Lindy Hop. It wasn't a slow, graceful waltz. It was fast, athletic, and acrobatic. No dancers would spin swing and throw their partners into the air. It was a dance of pure, unadulterated joy. And it was the perfect escape for a world at war. Dance halls were magnets for young people. For a few hours, a soldier on leave or a factory worker after a long shift could forget everything. The music was loud, the floor was crowded, and the energy was electric. Big bands, led by titans like Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, and Glenn Miller, provided the live soundtrack. Their music, known as swing, was the pop music of the day. It was built for dancing. The jitterbug was more than just a dance, it was a cultural phenomenon. It broke down social barriers. On the dance floor, your rank or your job didn't matter as much as your ability to keep up with the music. The dance itself was improvisational and expressive. There were basic steps, but the best dancers added their own flair, their own spectacular air steps. It was a celebration of freedom and individuality at a time when both were under threat. The dance was also a little bit dangerous, a little bit rebellious. Older generations sometimes looked down on it as wild and undignified. That, of course, only made it more appealing to the young. It was their dance, their music, their culture. In places like the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem, New York, the dancing reached incredible artistic heights with dancers of all backgrounds coming together to innovate and compete. The war spread the dance across the globe. American GIs brought the jitterbug with them to Britain, to Australia, to France. They would set up impromptu dances wherever they were stationed. A gramophone and a clear patch of ground were all they needed. For the local populations, these American soldiers, with their confident energy, their chewing gum, and their wild dancing, were a sight to behold. The dance became a symbol of the vibrant, optimistic American spirit. It was a dance that looked towards the future, a future where there would be enough energy and joy to literally throw people in the air. As described in Lynn Olson's book, Citizens of London, the arrival of the GIs and their culture had a profound and lasting impact on British society. Well, we have the films and the photographs of these dancers frozen in midair. We can still listen to the recordings of Glenn Miller's In the Mood. But can we ever truly feel the desperate energy of that dance floor? The need to move, to sweat, to feel alive for one more night? How many lifelong relationships began with a nervous invitation to jitterbug? And in the most daring aerial moves were the dancers trying to escape not just the floor, but the crushing weight of the world itself. It's number 15, how do you watch a movie when the world is on fire? Imagine sitting in a dark, velvet-seated theater. The lights go down, the newsreel starts, you see real images of cities in ruins, of ships sinking, of soldiers marching. The report is grim, and then the feature film begins. It's a musical, Judy Garland is singing, Mickey Rooney is putting on a show. For the next 90 minutes, you are somewhere else entirely. This was the weekly ritual for tens of millions of people. The cinema was the undisputed king of entertainment. In the US, weekly movie attendance hovered around 85 million people. In Britain, it was nearly 30 million. The movie palace was a refuge, a dream factory. For a few pennies, you could escape the blackout, the rationing, and the constant worry. Hollywood knew its job was to keep morale high, and it did so with a flood of films designed to distract, inspire, and entertain. There were the musicals with their lavish song and dance numbers that defied the reality of wartime austerity. It's films like For Me and My Gal, 1942 were pure escapism. There were the comedies, Abbott and Costello joined the army, and Buck Privates, 1941, and managed to make military life look like a series of hilarious blunders. The romantic dramas, which often centered on the pain of separation and the hope of reunion, a theme that resonated deeply with audiences. But Hollywood also made war films. Lots of them. These weren't typically gritty, realistic portrayals of combat. They were patriotic adventures. Films like Wake Island 1942 and Baton 1943 depicted American soldiers as brave, wisecracking heroes who always fought for what was right. The enemy was portrayed as a one-dimensional, often cartoonishly evil force. These films were powerful recruitment and propaganda tools. They reassured the public that the war was just and that victory was inevitable. As historian Clayton Arcapes argues in his book Hollywood Goes to War, the government and the film industry worked in close partnership to shape the messages the American public received. In Britain, the films were often grittier and more realistic. They focused on the quiet heroism of ordinary people, factory workers, firefighters, housewives. Films like Millions Like Us, 1943, celebrated the collective effort of the home front. They were less about glamour and more about resilience. Going to the cinema was a complete experience. It wasn't just the film, it was the cartoons, the newsreel, the previews. It was the communal act of sitting in the dark with hundreds of other people, sharing in the laughter, the tears, and the thrill. It was a powerful dose of normalcy. In the dark, for a little while, everyone was equal and everyone was safe. And we know how many tickets were sold and which films were the biggest box office hits, but how many people were persuaded to enlist or to buy war bonds because of a scene in a movie. Did the constant diet of heroic, sanitized war films give civilians a dangerously false impression of what their loved ones were actually experiencing on the front lines? And in the darkness of the theater, how many private, silent tears were shed for a reality that was far more brutal than anything shown on the screen? Number 14, could a song be more powerful than a speech? There was one song that captured the feeling of the era more than any other. It wasn't a rousing, patriotic anthem. It was a slow, melancholy ballad called White Christmas. Sung by Bing Crosby, it was released in 1942. It became the best-selling single of all time. But why? Because it was a song about longing. It was about remembering a time of peace and dreaming of its return. For soldiers stationed in the sweltering jungles of the Pacific or the deserts of North Africa, a song about snow and family was an almost unbearably powerful reminder of home. And music was everywhere during the war. It poured out of radios, it was played in dance halls, and it was sung by troops on the march. It was a shared language that connected everyone. The popular music of the day, the swing and big band sound was upbeat and optimistic. Songs like the Andrews Sisters Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy were energetic and fun, perfect for boosting spirits. But there was another type of music that was just as important. These were the sentimental ballads, the songs of love and separation. In Britain, one voice defined this sound: Vera Lynn. She was known as the Force's sweetheart. Her songs like We'll Meet Again and There'll Be Bluebirds Over the White Cliffs of Dover spoke directly to the anxieties of the time. They didn't promise a quick victory, they promised reunion. They acknowledged the pain of separation, but offered a sliver of hope for the future. Her radio show, Sincerely Yours, where she passed on messages from families to soldiers at the front, was immensely popular. She wasn't a glamorous star, she was like the girl next door. Her voice was a comfort, a sonic hug for a nation under siege. Music was also a participatory sport. People gathered around pianos in pubs and in their homes for sing-alongs. Soldiers wrote their own parodies of popular songs, often with dark or cynical lyrics that reflected their reality. These unofficial anthems were a way of blowing off steam and building camaraderie. Music was also portable. The V-Disc program, started in 1943, was a project to record music specifically for U.S. troops and ship the records. The V stood for victory to them overseas. These were special recordings, not available to the public, featuring all the top artists of the day. It was a massive undertaking designed to give the soldiers a piece of home they could hold and play themselves. The war also changed music. The loss of so many musicians to the military, including big names like Glenn Miller, who disappeared on a flight over the English Channel in 1944, marked the beginning of the end for the big band era. New sounds and smaller combos were already beginning to emerge. The music of the war years was the soundtrack for a generation, a collection of songs that could make you dance, make you cry, and make you believe that someday you would meet again. We can listen to these songs today. We know who wrote them and who sang them. But can we ever truly hear them the way people did then, with the constant threat of loss hanging in the air? How many secret fears were quieted by a familiar melody on the radio late at night? And was a song like We'll Meet Again a simple comfort, or was it a promise so profound it gave people the strength to endure years of separation? Number 13, what story did A Needle and Thread tell? In the quiet hours of the evening, after the children were in bed, In the dim light of a living room or the tense silence of an air raid shelter, you would hear a soft, rhythmic clicking sound. It was the sound of knitting needles. Millions of women and some men were knitting. They were knitting socks, scarves, sweaters, and gloves for the troops. It was a domestic skill turned into a vital part of the war machine. Knit for Victory campaigns were launched across the Allied nations. Organizations like the Red Cross distributed patterns and collected finished garments. The need was immense. A soldier in a cold, wet trench needed warm, dry socks more than almost anything. A sailor on watch in the North Atlantic needed a thick sweater. A pilot needed warm gloves. The items produced by armies were functional, but a hand-knitted garment was different. It was a tangible piece of home. It was a message of care sent from a stranger. Knitting was the perfect wartime activity. It was portable. You could do it on a bus, while listening to the radio, or while waiting in a queue for rations. It was productive. It turned idle moments into something useful, and it was calming. The repetitive motion of the needles was a way to manage anxiety. It kept the hands busy and the mind focused, as described in works like Jambusters by Julie Summers, which details the work of the Women's Institute in Britain. These domestic activities were central to maintaining community and morale. The scale of this effort was staggering. In the United States alone, the Red Cross estimated that by 1941, there were 1.5 million volunteer knitters. They produced millions of garments over the course of the war. Knitting became a social activity. Women formed knitting circles, gathering in each other's homes or in community centers. They would knit, chat, and share news. These circles were a vital support network. They were a place to share worries about loved ones overseas and to find strength in a shared purpose. Even children were taught to knit. It was part of the school curriculum. They would knit small, simple squares that could be sewn together to make blankets. It was a way for everyone, no matter how young, to feel like they were contributing. The slogan was, "Knit your bit." Every stitch was a small act of defiance, a small contribution to the comfort of a soldier. A drop stitch was a minor frustration in a world of major tragedies, something that could be fixed, a small bit of order that could be restored. We have the official numbers of how many tons of wool were used and how many items were shipped. We even have some of the original patterns. But what were the thoughts that were knitted into those millions of socks? What hopes and fears were woven into the threads of each scarf? And for a soldier pulling on a pair of warm, slightly lumpy, hand-knitted socks from a stranger 1,000 miles away, what did that small, anonymous act of kindness truly feel like? Mission number 12 was a library quieter than a battlefield. In a world filled with the noise of sirens, engines, and explosions, there was a place you could go for silence. The library. And during the war, people flocked to them. Reading was a quiet rebellion. It was an escape that required nothing more than a library card and a little bit of light. In book, publishing boomed during the war despite paper shortages. People were hungry for stories. They wanted to be transported away from their difficult reality. And publishers delivered. There were sweeping historical romances, intricate detective stories, and thrilling spy novels. And writers like Agatha Christie continued to produce bestsellers. Her 1939 novel, And Then There Were. None was a massive hit. It provided a different kind of suspense, a puzzle to be solved that had nothing to do with the war. This kind of mental distraction was a precious commodity, but people also read to understand. Nonfiction books about the war, biographies of military leaders, and analyses of current events were incredibly popular. John Hersey's Into the Valley, a short book about a single Marine company's battle on Guadalcanal, was published in 1943. It gave a stark, unglamorized account of combat that stood in sharp contrast to the heroic war movies. Reading was a way to process the incomprehensible events that were shaping the world. The most significant innovation in wartime reading was the paperback. In 1942, a group of American publishers launched the Armed Services Editions ASEs. These were small, soft-cover books designed to fit into the pocket of a military uniform. They were printed on cheap paper and given away for free to soldiers, sailors, and airmen. The project was enormous. Over the course of the war, more than 122 million copies of over 1,300 different titles were distributed. The range of books was incredible. There were westerns, classics, poetry, and history. A soldier could be reading F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby one week and a collection of cartoons the next. For many young men who had never been big readers, the ASEs were a revelation. They discovered a love of literature in the most unlikely of places, in barracks, on transport ships, in foxholes. These books were a lifeline. They were a cure for boredom, a source of comfort, and a reminder of a world of ideas and imagination that existed beyond the war. As detailed in Molly Guptill Manning's book, When Books Went to War, this program had a profound and lasting effect on American culture, helping to create a new generation of readers and legitimizing the paperback as a serious format. Libraries on the home front also did their part. They promoted books that explained the war effort, they hosted community events, and they remained a quiet, stable presence in a chaotic world. To open a book was to open a door. It was a way to travel without moving, to experience other lives, and to find perspective. It was an act of concentration in an age of distraction, an act of quiet in an age of noise. We know which books were published and how many ASCs were printed. But how many soldiers' lives were changed by a single book they read in a trench? Did a character in a novel ever give someone the courage to endure another day? And in the silent, shared space of a public library, how many strangers found a sense of community simply by reading side by side, each lost in their own private paper world? And number 11, did a letter carry more than words? Before email, before text messages, there was the letter. And during the war, the simple act of writing and receiving a letter was perhaps the most important form of entertainment and connection there was. Mail call was the most anticipated moment of the day for any soldier. A letter from home was proof that the world you left behind still existed. It was a tangible link to love, to family, to normalcy. The volume of mail was incredible. The U.S. Military Postal Service in 1945 handled nearly 2.5 billion pieces of mail. To manage this flood of paper, a new technology was introduced, V-mail or Victory Mail. A person would write a letter on a special form. The form was then photographed, reduced to the size of a thumbnail on a roll of microfilm, and flown overseas. At its destination, it was printed out at about 1/4 size and delivered. It wasn't private censors read everyone, and it was impersonal. But it was fast and it was light. A single mail sack that could carry 2,000 pounds of regular letters could carry the microfilm for 150,000 V-mail letters. Writing a letter was a creative act. It was a way to shape a narrative. People on the home front often tried to keep their letters cheerful and full of news about daily life, the dog, the garden, a movie they saw. They censored themselves, avoiding bad news or complaints that might worry their loved ones on the front lines. Soldiers did the same. They wrote about the funny things that happened, their friends, the strange places they were seeing. They rarely wrote about the fear or the horror of combat. The letters were a performance of normalcy, an attempt by both sender and receiver to protect each other. But even with the censorship, the letters were a vital emotional outlet. The act of sitting down and putting thoughts on paper was a way to process what was happening. It was a conversation that stretched across weeks and thousands of miles. The physical object of the letter itself was a treasure. A soldier would read a letter from his sweetheart until it fell apart, carrying it in his pocket, sleeping with it under his pillow. The scent of his wife's perfume on the paper, the familiar slant of his mother's handwriting, and these were powerful sensory connections to a world far away. The letters weren't just about personal news. As historian Andrew Carroll documents in his collections of war letters, they are a rich and intimate record of the war. They tell the story of the conflict not from the perspective of generals and politicians, but from the perspective of the ordinary people who lived it. They are full of love, boredom, humor, and fear. They are a testament to the profound human need to connect, to tell our stories, and to know that we are not forgotten. We have archives full of these letters, saved by families for generations. We can read the words, but can we ever truly understand the weight of a letter in a soldier's hand? How many times was a single flimsy piece of paper the only thing standing between a person and complete despair? And what about the letters that were never written, the stories that were never told, the final goodbyes that were lost in transit or silenced by a censor's pen? Number 10. Could you build a world on a tabletop? When the blackout curtains were drawn and the family was gathered inside, what was there to do? For many, the answer was to clear the dining table and open a box. Board games and card games saw a huge surge in popularity. They were a way to pass the long, dark evenings. They were a cheap, reusable form of entertainment, and they were a way to bring people together. Games like Monopoly, which had been around since the 1930s, were a perfect fit for the times. The game was about strategy, luck, and ruthless capitalism, a strange but compelling fantasy in an era of rationing and government control. It allowed players to imagine a world of wealth and property, even as their own resources were limited. In Britain, a special version of Monopoly was even created and sent to prisoners of war in camps run by the German regime. As detailed by historian Victor Watson, these games, distributed by a fake charity, had hidden compartments containing maps, compasses, and real currency to aid in escape attempts. A board game became a Trojan horse. Card games were even more ubiquitous. A single deck of cards could provide endless hours of entertainment. Games like bridge, rummy, and poker were played in homes, in community centers, and especially in military barracks. For soldiers, a card game was a ritual. It was a way to bond, to compete, and to kill the endless hours of waiting. The stakes didn't have to be high, a few cigarettes or candy bars. The game itself was the point. It was a structured activity with clear rules in a life that was often chaotic and unpredictable. It required skill, bluffing, and concentration, pulling the mind away from the anxieties of war. Jigsaw puzzles were also incredibly popular. They were a quiet, solitary, or cooperative activity. The slow, methodical process of piecing together a picture, often a peaceful country scene or a famous painting, was a form of meditation. It was about creating order out of chaos, one piece at a time. The satisfaction of snapping the last piece into place was a small but significant victory. These games were more than just a way to pass the time. They were a microcosm of society. They taught rules, sportsmanship, and strategy. They created moments of intense competition and shared laughter. A family argument over a monopoly property or a soldier's triumphant shout after winning a hand of poker were signs of life. They were small dramas that played out on a tabletop, temporarily eclipsing the much larger drama outside. They were a way of practicing being human, with all its petty rivalries and joyful collaborations in a time when humanity itself was being tested. We know which games were popular, and we can see the clever designs of the POW escape kits, but how many military strategies were first sketched out during a lull in a card game? How many family tensions were smoothed over or exacerbated by the roll of the dice? And what did it feel like to finish a 1,000-piece puzzle of a peaceful English garden while the sound of air raid sirens echoed in the distance? Number 9. Did the stage go dark? With the cities blacked out and many of the brightest stars away in uniform or entertaining the troops, one might think the theater would have died. It didn't. In fact, in many places, it thrived. Live theater provided something that movies and radio could, not the raw, immediate energy of human beings on a stage right in front of you. In London, the theater was a symbol of defiance. During the Blitz, the city's entertainment district, the West End, was a target. Theaters were damaged, and performances were interrupted by air raid warnings. But the shows went on. The government initially closed all theaters at the outbreak of war, but public demand was so great that they soon reopened. Going to a play was an act of courage and normalcy. The audience and the actors were, quite literally, in it together. A famous story from the time tells of a performance where a bomb fell nearby, shaking the theater. One of the actors, a woman, calmly stepped forward and began to sing, leading the entire audience in a song until the all-clear was given. The type of theater that was popular shifted. Lavish, expensive productions were difficult to mount. Instead, witty, light comedies and revues became the hits. Noel Coward's play Blithe Spirit, a comedy about a man haunted by the ghost of his witty first wife, premiered in 1941 and was a smash success. It offered audiences a sophisticated and hilarious escape. There were also patriotic pageants and shows designed to boost morale. In the United States, Broadway continued to shine, but the biggest theatrical story was the creation of the USO camp shows. In 1941, the United Service Organization's USO was formed to provide recreation and entertainment for American troops. The camp shows division was a massive undertaking. It sent thousands of entertainers, from huge stars to unknown vaudeville acts, to perform for soldiers at home and abroad. The most famous of these entertainers was Bob Hope. He became a tireless performer for the troops, traveling millions of miles to perform in every theater of war. His shows were a mix of comedy, music, and beautiful women. His jokes were often tailored to the specific location and the gripes of the soldiers stationed there. He was a connection to the glamorous world of Hollywood, and his willingness to travel to dangerous, uncomfortable places earned him the eternal gratitude of the GIs. As he is quoted in his biographies, he saw it as his duty to bring a breath of home to the troops. But it wasn't just professionals. Amateur theatricals flourished. Soldiers put on their own shows in barracks. Factory workers formed drama clubs. These productions gave people a creative outlet and a sense of community. To put on a play, even a small one, was to create a world, to tell a story, and to make something new in a time of great destruction. We have the playbills and the reviews from the hit shows. We have photographs of Bob Hope entertaining a sea of soldiers. But what did it feel like to be an actor on a London stage, trying to remember your lines while listening for the sound of bombers overhead? How many soldiers, watching a simple skit in a makeshift theater, felt, for the first time in months, like an individual person again, and not just a number? And what secrets and sorrows were hidden behind the grease of paint and the forced smiles of the performers? Number 8 was a ball game. Just a game. In the summer of 1942, the commissioner of baseball wrote to President Roosevelt. He asked if the professional baseball season should be canceled for the duration of the war. The president's response became famous. In what is now known as the Green Light Letter, Roosevelt wrote, "I honestly feel that it would be best for the country to keep baseball going." He argued that it was a source of recreation for the American people and that they needed a distraction. So the games went on, but it wasn't the same baseball. By 1943, thousands of professional players, including superstars like Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams, had enlisted in the military. The teams were filled with older players, very young prospects, and men who were physically ineligible for service. The quality of play declined, but it didn't matter. People still came to the ballpark. It was a familiar ritual, a slice of American life that continued even as the world changed. Listening to a game on the radio was a comforting, timeless summer sound. The war created a unique opportunity in sports. With so many men gone, a new league was formed, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League AAGPBL, founded in 1943. It was the brainchild of Philip K. Wrigley, the chewing gum magnate and owner of the Chicago Cubs. The league was a novelty at first, but the women were serious athletes. They played a fast, exciting game. To maintain a feminine image, they were required to play in short skirts and attend charm school. But on the field, they were tough. The league was a success, drawing hundreds of thousands of fans and providing a much-needed sporting spectacle. It gave women a chance to be professional athletes on a national stage, an opportunity that wouldn't come again for decades. The sports were also a crucial part of life for the soldiers themselves. The military organized vast athletic programs. Baseball, football, and boxing were incredibly popular. These games were more than just exercise. They were a way to relieve stress, build teamwork, and maintain a sense of identity. A game of baseball on a dusty field in the South Pacific was a powerful reminder of home. Boxing matches were huge events, drawing massive crowds of soldiers eager for a spectacle. Even in the most brutal of environments, sports found a way. In prisoner of war camps, captives organized their own leagues and even held Olympics, competing in track and field events. As described in memoirs like that of Louis Zamperini in Unbroken, these games were acts of defiance. They were a way for the prisoners to maintain their physical and mental health, to assert their humanity in a system designed to crush it. Your common force, you're designed to, as a game, was to create your own rules, your own world for a few precious hours. But how many tense situations on the battlefield were diffused because the soldiers involved had learned to work as a team on a football field? How did it feel for a woman to be cheered by thousands for hitting a home run and then to be expected to return to a more traditional role after the war? And in the makeshift games played by prisoners of war, was the final score ever as important as the simple, defiant act of playing it all? Number 7. Could you hear freedom in a drum solo? There was a new sound brewing in the small, smoky jazz clubs of New York City, particularly in places like Minton's Playhouse in Harlem. It was fast, complex, and unpredictable. The musicians were playing for themselves, pushing the boundaries of their instruments and of music itself. They called it bebop, and it was the rebellious soundtrack of a changing world. The dominant music of the war years was swing. It was popular, danceable, and often formulaic. It was the music of the establishment. Bebop was the opposite. It is led by brilliant young African-American musicians like Charlie Parker on saxophone, Dizzy Gillespie on trumpet, and Thelonious Monk on piano. Bebop was a revolution. It featured lightning, fast solos, complex chord progressions, and a rhythmic drive that was exhilarating and challenging. It was not music for dancing, it was music for listening. For the musicians who created it, bebop was an artistic statement. It was a claim to legitimacy. They were not just entertainers, they were artists. In a society that was still deeply segregated, even in the war for freedom, this new intellectually demanding music was a declaration of black creativity and sophistication. It was a sound that refused to be put in a box. The war itself had an impact on its development. The 1942 to 1944 musicians' strike, A dispute over royalty payments meant that for 2 years, very few commercial recordings were made. This forced the new music to develop underground, in live sessions, and after-hours jams, away from the pressures of the commercial music industry. For the young people who became fans of bebop, it was a secret language. It was cool, it was hip, it was modern. It was the sound of the future. To appreciate bebop was to be in the know. It was a form of rebellion against the mainstream culture of their parents. In a world that demanded conformity and collective effort, bebop celebrated radical individuality. The music itself seemed to reflect the chaos of the times. The frantic tempos and dissonant harmonies could sound like the noise and anxiety of modern urban life. But within that chaos, there was an incredible beauty and logic. It was the sound of freedom, the freedom to improvise, to break the rules, to create something new on the spot. It was a deeply democratic music in its way. Each musician in the small combo had a chance to solo, to have their voice heard. While the big bands were a musical representation of a large organized army, a bebop quintet was like a small, agile commando unit full of individual virtuosos working together. We have the recordings from after the strike, which, give us a glimpse into this musical explosion. We have the stories of the legendary jam sessions at Minton's. But what did it feel like to be in one of those clubs, hearing that sound for the very first time? Was bebop a conscious protest against the social and racial injustices that the war had failed to solve? And how much of the frantic energy of the music was a direct response to the violence and uncertainty of a world at war? A sound that was as explosive and unpredictable as a bomb. Number 6, did a toy soldier fight a real war? For children, the war was a confusing and frightening backdrop to their lives. They understood it through the lens of their games. And the most common game was war itself. In parks, in backyards, and on city streets, children reenacted the battles they heard about on the radio and saw in the newsreels. One group would be the good guys, the other the bad guys. They would use sticks for rifles and make the sounds of explosions with their mouths. This wasn't just a game, it was a way for children to process what was happening. By playing war, they could take a terrifying, uncontrollable reality and shrink it down to a manageable size. In their games, they were the heroes, they were in control, they could decide who won and who lost. Child psychologists today understand this as a form of therapeutic play, a way for children to work through their fears and anxieties. The toys they played with reflected the conflict. Toy soldiers, airplanes, and tanks were hugely popular. But because of wartime material shortages, these toys changed. Metal was needed for the war effort, so many toys were made from wood, cardboard, or a new material called plastic. Children became adept at making their own toys. A piece of wood could be whittled into a submarine. A cardboard box could become a fortress. This act of creation was another way of imposing order and control. For adults, model making was a serious hobby. Building scale models of warships, bombers, and fighter planes was a popular pastime. It was a meticulous, detail-oriented craft that required immense patience. It was a way to understand the complex machinery of the war. By building a perfect replica of a Spitfire or a B-17 bomber, a person on the home front could feel a closer connection to the technology and the people who were fighting the war. These models were displayed with pride on mantelpieces and in bedrooms. They were symbols of technological prowess and patriotic spirit. The war also blurred the lines between toys and training. The military used models extensively. They built scale models of battlefields to plan strategies. They used model airplanes to teach aircraft recognition. A skill that was a hobby for a civilian was a life or death necessity for a soldier. The ability to identify the silhouette of an enemy plane in a split second could be the difference between survival and disaster. The games of childhood had a deadly serious adult counterpart. We can see the surviving toys and model kits from the era. We can read the educational articles in magazines on how to identify military aircraft. But what were the rules of the war games that children played? How did they decide who had been hit? Did these games make the reality of war seem more acceptable, or did they help children to understand its grim logic? And for an adult, spending hours perfectly replicating a machine of destruction was the act of creation, a way of admiring the machine, or a way of taming it. Number 5, what did you wear to a revolution? Fashion seems like the ultimate frivolity in a time of crisis. But during the war, what people wore was a matter of government regulation and personal expression. Clothes became a uniform for civilians, a way of showing that you were part of the collective effort. governments on both sides of the conflict imposed strict rationing and austerity measures on clothing. In Britain, the utility scheme, introduced in 1941, dictated the design of clothing. There were rules about how many pockets a coat could have, how much fabric could be used in a skirt, and whether a shirt could have a double cuff. The idea was to save fabric and labor for the war effort. The clothes were designed to be simple, durable, and practical. Fashion was, in effect, put on hold. In the United States, similar rules were put in place by the War Production Board. Their Regulation L-85, issued in 1942, restricted the use of natural fibers and dictated a more streamlined silhouette for women's clothing. Skirts became shorter and narrower. Gone were the elaborate pleats, ruffles, and trimmings of the pre-war era. Men's suits lost their vests, pocket flaps, and trouser cuffs. The victory suit was a symbol of patriotic conservation. But within these restrictions, people found ways to express their individuality. This was a form of entertainment, a creative challenge. Women learned to be resourceful. An old dress could be taken apart and remade into a new blouse. A man's old suit could be tailored into a smart outfit for a woman. Make, do, and mend was the slogan in Britain. Pamphlets and magazines were full of tips on how to care for clothes, patch holes, and update old garments with new collars or accessories. A colorful scarf, a handmade piece of jewelry, or a creative hairstyle could transform a drab utility outfit. For women who entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, fashion became practical. Trousers, or slacks, once worn only for very casual occasions, became standard attire for factory work. The image of Rosie the Riveter with her hair tied up in a bandana and wearing practical work clothes became an icon. This was a radical shift in women's wear born of necessity that would have a lasting impact. There was also a fashion rebellion. In America, young Mexican-American men known as pachucos adopted the zoot suit. It was the absolute opposite of the victory suit. It had a long, draped jacket with wide shoulders and voluminous trousers that were pegged tightly at the ankle. It was flamboyant, extravagant, and deliberately wasteful of fabric. It was a statement of cultural identity and defiance against the mainstream. In 1943, this clash of cultures and styles erupted into the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles, where servicemen attacked young men wearing the suits. It was a stark reminder that even in a time of national unity, fashion could be a flashpoint for social and racial tensions. We have the utility patterns and the government regulations. We can see the Zoot suits in museums. But how did it feel to wear the same simple dress for years, trying to find new ways to make it feel special? Was the act of mending a sock a tedious chore, or a small, satisfying victory against entropy and waste? And in the flamboyant drape of a zoot suit, was there a swagger that was also a kind of armor against the hostile world? Number 4, how do you throw a party on an empty stomach? Food is at the heart of every celebration, but how do you celebrate when there is barely enough to eat? During the war, food was strictly rationed. In Britain, a weekly adult ration in 1943 might include 1 egg, 2 ounces of butter, and 4 ounces of bacon. Meat was so scarce it was measured in price rather than weight. In the US, rationing was less severe but still a daily reality. Sugar, coffee, meat, and canned goods were all limited by a complex system of ration books and points. Yet, people still found ways to entertain, to share a meal, to celebrate a birthday or a holiday. It just required immense creativity and resourcefulness. Cooking became a science of substitution. A mock goose might be made from potatoes and lentils. Eggless, butterless, sugarless cakes were invented. A cookbook from the era is a testament to culinary ingenuity. Carrots were used as a sweetener in desserts. Potatoes were used to stretch bread dough. Nothing was wasted. The government actively encouraged this creativity through propaganda. In Britain, the Ministry of Food's food flashes were short films shown before movies offering tips and recipes. Characters like Potato Pete and Dr. Carrot promoted the use of homegrown vegetables. The message was that eating well, even with rations, was a patriotic duty. Entertaining at home became a challenge. A dinner party was a major logistical operation. It might require saving up ration points for weeks. Guests might be asked to bring a contribution, a little sugar, a few vegetables from their garden. These potluck-style gatherings were a way of pooling resources and sharing the burden. Despite the scarcity, the rituals of hospitality were important. They were a way of maintaining social bonds and a sense of normalcy. For soldiers, food was often monotonous and unappetizing, but a package from home containing a cake or some cookies was a treasure. These items were shared among friends, a taste of a world beyond K-rations and mess hall stew. In liberated towns, the first act of the soldiers was often to share their own food, chocolate, chewing gum, canned goods, with the starving local population. It was a powerful symbol of friendship and a return to civilization. The simple act of sharing a meal, no matter how meager, took on a profound significance. It was an affirmation of community. To invite someone to your table when you had little to spare was a generous act. To eat together was to momentarily forget the shortages and the anxieties. It was a small, quiet celebration of the fact that you were still here, still together, and still able to break bread. We have the ration books and the government-issued recipes, but what did that mock food actually taste like? How many friendships were solidified over a shared meager meal? And in a world of scarcity, did the simple flavors of a homegrown vegetable or a piece of carefully saved chocolate taste better than anything we eat today in our world of abundance? Number 3, did an animal know there was a war on? In the midst of human conflict, what happens to the animals? For many people, a pet was a source of immense comfort, a living, breathing creature that was blissfully unaware of the global chaos. A dog was always happy to see you. A cat's purr was a calming sound in a tense household. They were a reminder of a simpler, more innocent world. But owning a pet during the war was difficult. Food was rationed for humans, it was even scarcer for animals. Pet owners had to be resourceful, feeding their animals scraps and leftovers. In Britain, at the very beginning of the war, a government pamphlet about air raids advised people on what to do with their pets. Fearing a food shortage and the chaos of bombing and misinterpreting the advice, hundreds of thousands of pet owners made a heartbreaking decision. In what became known as the British Pet Massacre, an estimated 750,000 pets were euthanized in the first week of the war. It was a tragic, panicked reaction. Many who kept their pets later found them to be an essential part of their emotional survival kit. But animals also went to war. Dogs were trained for a variety of tasks. They served as sentries, scouts, and messengers. They were used to detect mines and to find wounded soldiers on the battlefield. A collie named Rob made over 20 parachute jumps with British Special Forces. A tiny Yorkshire Terrier named Smokey was found in a foxhole in New Guinea and became a famous war dog, helping to run communication lines through narrow pipes and entertaining wounded soldiers in hospitals. These hero dogs were celebrated in the press, their stories providing a welcome distraction from the human cost of the war. Pigeons were also vital. Long before radio was reliable on a battlefield, homing pigeons were used to carry messages. They flew through enemy fire to deliver critical information from isolated units. The Dickon Medal, instituted in the UK in 1943, became known as the Animals Victoria Cross. Of the 54 medals awarded during the war, 32 of them went to pigeons. Zoos faced incredible challenges. How do you feed a lion or an elephant during rationing? Many animals were put down. Others starved. During air raids, there was the constant fear that a bomb could hit the zoo, releasing dangerous animals into the city. In Belfast, the zookeepers had to shoot 23 animals after the city was heavily bombed in 1941. Yet for civilians, a trip to the zoo was a popular and affordable outing, a chance to see a creature from a different part of the world and to forget the war for an afternoon. The survival of a particular zoo animal, like the famous polar bear Brumas at the London Zoo, could become a symbol of the city's own resilience. We know the stories of the famous war animals and the statistics of the tragic pet call, but what about the countless unrecorded moments of comfort? How many frightened children were soothed by hugging their dog during an air raid? Did a soldier, sharing his rations with a stray cat in a ruined city, feel a flicker of his own humanity return? And for the animals themselves, what was it like to live in a world that had suddenly become filled with loud noises, strange smells, and terrified humans? Number 2, what do you do on a Sunday afternoon? For many people, the war was not a constant sequence of dramatic events. It was long periods of boredom and routine, punctuated by moments of terror or excitement. The simple, quiet ways people passed the time were as important as any grand spectacle. These small, personal forms of entertainment were the fabric of daily life. Taking a walk was a popular pastime. It was free, it was healthy, and it was a way to get out of the house. In Britain, rambling and hiking clubs became more popular. People would explore their local countryside, a welcome escape from the blacked-out, crowded cities. A simple walk in a park, if one was still open and hadn't been turned into a victory garden, was a chance for a bit of fresh air and peace. Hobbies provided a focus for the mind and a task for the hands. People built things, they fixed things, they learned new skills. With new goods being scarce, the ability to repair a bicycle, a radio, or a pair of shoes was incredibly valuable. These practical hobbies were also a source of pride and satisfaction. Storytelling was a timeless form of entertainment. Your families would gather and share stories. Soldiers in barracks would swap tall tales and exaggerated accounts of their pre-war lives. In a world before television, a person who could tell a good story was the center of attention. This oral tradition was a way of passing on family history, sharing values, and simply making each other laugh. And then there was daydreaming, the internal escape. In a factory, doing the same repetitive task for hours on end, a worker could let their mind wander. They could dream of the future, of what they would do after the war. This phrase, after the war, became a mantra. It was a repository for all the deferred hopes and dreams. People would plan the house they would build, the trip they would take, the meal they would eat. This act of imagining a peaceful future was itself a form of resistance against a present that was trying to crush all hope. These quiet pastimes were not about escaping reality so much as they were about surviving it. They were about finding small pockets of peace, creativity, and personal freedom in a world that was dominated by control, destruction, and collective duty. They're about remembering how to be an individual, how to be quiet, how to be at peace with oneself, even for a few moments. They were the small, silent acts of entertainment that made the long years of the war bearable. We know from diaries and letters that people engaged in these activities. But how can we measure the value of a quiet walk? What epic stories were told in a barracks that have been completely forgotten? And how many brilliant plans for a better, more peaceful world were hatched in the daydreams of ordinary people? Plans that helped them endure the present and perhaps to build the future. Number one, did a kiss mean more in a time of war? Of all the ways people entertained themselves, of all the distractions and escapes, perhaps the most powerful was also the most simple human connection. Falling in love, getting married, starting a family, these fundamental human dramas did not stop because of the war. They became more urgent, more intense, more meaningful. Romance flourished in the high-stakes atmosphere of the war. There was a sense of life for today, for tomorrow we may die. This led to whirlwind courtships and hasty marriages. A soldier on a 48-hour leave might meet a girl at a dance, fall in love, and be engaged before he had to return to the front. A train station platform became a stage for countless scenes of tearful goodbyes and joyous reunions. The kiss, a simple act of affection, became a symbol of what was being fought for: love, family, a future. A photograph of a sailor kissing a nurse in Times Square on VJ Day became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century because it captured that explosion of relief and pent-up emotion. These relationships were often conducted through letters, as we've seen. The written word had to carry the full weight of a love affair. But the moments people had together were cherished. A weekend pass, a short leave, these were precious, fleeting opportunities for intimacy. The war changed the rules of courtship. With so many men away, women had more social freedom. They went to dances and movies unchaperoned. The presence of millions of foreign soldiers, Americans in Britain, for example, also created new and exciting, and sometimes complicated, romantic possibilities. Marriage rates spiked. In the US, the number of marriages per capita rose significantly after the country entered the war. People wanted to formalize their bonds before being separated by vast distances and uncertain futures. And despite the uncertainty, people had children. A baby was a profound statement of hope. It was a belief in a future that would exist beyond the war. Raising a child in wartime was incredibly difficult, but it was also a powerful, life-affirming act. This wasn't just about romantic love. The bonds of friendship became incredibly intense. Soldiers in a unit formed a brotherhood that was often closer than family. They relied on each other for their very survival. On the home front, neighbors who had been strangers before the war became close friends, sharing resources, looking after each other's children, and providing emotional support during air raids. The shared experience of the war created a powerful sense of community and solidarity. In the end, the greatest entertainment, the most profound distraction from the grim reality of the war, was each other. It was the conversation in a pub, the shared joke on a factory floor, the love letter sent across an ocean, the hug from a child, the dance with a stranger. These were the moments that reminded people what they were fighting for. It wasn't just for nations or ideologies. It was for the small, beautiful, complicated, business of being human. We have the marriage statistics and the birth rates. We have the iconic photographs. But can we ever truly comprehend the intensity of a wartime romance lived under the shadow of death? How many friendships forged in the heat of battle were the most important relationships in a person's life? And was the simple, desperate, hopeful act of falling in love the ultimate act of defiance against a world that seemed determined to tear everything apart?